Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something very basic and simple that we see every day in our lives, but maybe sometimes you don't notice it, and maybe sometimes it's not quite defined right, and that's the concept of media bias. And it's one of those things that, we kind of wrestle with because, well, we like to hear the truth. We'd like to think we're getting the truth, or maybe we just want to hear our side and we don't want to hear the other side. And so we have to wrestle with the concept of what does it even mean to be biased, and how do we recognize bias, and can we defeat media bias? Well, the quick idea of bias is quite simple. Do you have an inclination towards something? Well, yes. Everyone does. We all think that we like certain things and we dislike other things. So the things that we do like, we tend to lean towards. The things we don't like, we kind of shy away from. And we see that regularly in the concept of bias. So like this, don't like that, and we kind of push ourselves, whichever direction, accordingly. That's easy. That's simple. So then the question comes, well, can someone then be truly unbiased? Can I be objective? Like the idea when you look at like the Associated Press, style book, when you look at the Reuters, style book, and the whole push in journalism ethics is to have an unbiased, objective reporting stance. But is that even possible? To be fair to reporters, is it possible to be unbiased? And think about yourself. Are you unbiased towards anything? You could work, and really work, to be as objective as possible. But is it possible to be purely objective? Maybe even if you think of the idea of, well, I don't know anything about that, or I don't care about that topic, so I'm sure I could report on that objectively. Not so fast, just because the idea of not knowing is a bias, because it's not important enough that you cared to know, or so new that you didn't care to dig into, or maybe that once you start, you'll find out it's actually kind of interesting or disgusting or whatever, and you'll have an inclination one way or another. Same thing with something you don't care about. Well, you're already stating your bias. It's not important enough for me to care about, or I don't care about it. Just whatever in general. It's something I don't like, or I don't find it interesting. That's a bias. So can I be objective? And I think the first reality we need to understand is you can't be objective purely. You're going to have some type of inclination one way or another toward a thing. So if you're that way, reporters are people. Believe it or not, they are people too. And so they're going to have, obviously, their inclinations. Now, again, professionalism will dictate that you work towards objectivity. So is it possible for me to be fairly objective? I think so. I think I could be on certain issues. Certain things that I care deeply about, probably not very objective, no. But there are other things I'm sure I could work and be fairly objective. And again, that's, you and your own personal work. Now, some people, of course, who don't care to be objective, well, there you go. But, if you're looking on the news and you're complaining about media bias, you might be watching people who have a hard time controlling their subjectivity, and they can't be objective to save their lives. It's also quite possible you're confusing a journalist with a commentator, because some people will say, "Oh, that person on the news, they're so biased." Well, they might be serving in the role of commentator. So if you're looking at somebody on the political left or on the political right, they might be holding that place, and proudly so, that they will proudly admit that they're a progressive, or proudly admit that they're a conservative. And, those people are not working to be unbiased. They're getting paid to cover their area. Even in the old days of newspaper, you'd have columnists whose job was to focus on, having some kind of editorial mindset to where they're going to be given their opinion, and that's what they're paid to do. You have the same kind of thing in television, and of course social media is full of people who just want to tell you their opinion and belief on things from their particular bias. So you know that you're going to get this with a left-wing slant or a right-wing slant, and you just know how that's going to be. Now that's, again, commentators. But if you have someone who's saying, I am an objective, unbiased reporter, first of all, we have to stop you there and say, as we just clearly said, it's impossible to be unbiased and impossible to be objective. You can be as objective as possible, you can be as unbiased as possible, but you're still going to have some level of bias in you. So again, when people are in that position saying, no, I'm going to be a, quote unquote objective reporter, that's a different thing. So, making that distinction aside, what does bias actually look like when we start putting it into practice? Because there's some technical aspects of bias that makes it actually a little bit more difficult, and it's easy to put the blame on people when it could also be some other factors. So let's talk about this real quick. Now, the first one I talk about is the idea of space, a space bias. Now, I don't mean like outer space. I mean like actual physical space. Like, for example, you look at, newspapers, you look at magazines. Those things are so big, so if you have a newspaper that's 25 pages or 30 pages, they're even numbers, 30 pages, 28 pages, 26 pages, however many pages the newspaper happens to be, that's how big it is. Could they make a bigger newspaper for a special edition? Sure, but traditionally newspapers have a fairly well set size because that's what their contract is at the printing location. I know when I did student newspapers, like a physical newspaper, the print shop with whom we had a arrangement, we had so many pages. We would produce it all electronically, like in using Adobe InDesign, and then email the PDF, and they would print off the page count and fold it, and I'd pick up the stacks of, I think it was like 500 papers. And it's worked out that way. So how many papers am I getting printed? How many pages is the newspaper? So the newspaper's only so big. Same thing with magazines. It's physical media. It's only so big. Therefore, there's only so much space in there. Think about all the stuff that happens in the world. You physically can't put a good, solid, hard-hitting news story about everything that happens in the world inside a newspaper. Think how big that newspaper would be. You just couldn't actually carry it. You couldn't use it, and of course it'd probably cost like $85, and who's going to pay that for a newspaper? So there's physical limitations. So I know whenever I would have my students write, I would say, okay, this is like a 200-word story or a 500-word story, or it could very well be that you only had so much space depending on the advertising. Like in newspaper, they work on what's called the news hole. So you sell your ads, you place all your ads. So some are little bitty ads, some are full page ads, some are half and quarters and whatever. And then all the space that's left is the news hole. So you have to fill the hole with news. So on this page, I've got room for about 350 words. So if the writer, the journalist says, well, I've got a 400-word article, it's like, I have 350 word space, cut out 50 words, and we're in good shape. And then you have to learn to edit and cut out things to make it fit. So it's just sometimes literally the space is the thing. So I've got to cut out stories because I don't have space, or cut down stories to fit the space. And the same thing is true with magazines. So you have that actual space that you're trying to fit and fill in things into, and stuff goes by the wayside. The old stories on the cutting room floor, but in digital world, it's just delete it from your article when you're typing in Word or whatever you're using. So that's a real situation. So it's not necessarily a bias in that, like, ooh, I'm biased against or for this kind of thing. It's, look, there's only so much space. We just gotta cut it down, and that's true. Another thing that comes into play with, especially with electronic media, is the idea of time. So I've worked in radio, and it's one of those things that you've got so much time on a clock, so you can't add extra minutes or seconds to a day. So you're watching the clock, and you have your clock wheel, and in the clock wheel, you have it figured out. Okay, so at the top of the hour, so right at, say, noon, we're going to have the 12 o'clock news. So the news block is 6 minutes long. Okay, so in that 6 minutes, we're going to have news, and then we'll break for a commercial, and then we'll come back with like maybe traffic, then a commercial, then we'll come back with weather or sports or something like that. So you've got that clock, and this is the same kind of basic thing that works for television too. So you have the same kind of thing where your 12 o'clock news, your 5 p.m. news, whatever, 11 p.m. news. So you're going to have so much time. Well, so let's say you have a 6 minute block before your first, commercial break. Well, in that first 6 minute block of like actual hard news, well, let's just say 3 minutes is dedicated to local, 3 minutes is dedicated to national, or 4 and 2, or whatever it happens to be. Well, all the stuff that happens in the world you're going to cover in 2 minutes? Really? How fair is that going to be, that coverage? Obviously, you're going to cut out a lot of stories. There's only so much time. And if you have a news broadcast, let's say you're doing a 1-hour news show, well, you're going to have approximately 20 minutes of commercials in that hour long. So approximately 10 minutes of commercials per half hour. So you're going to have 40 minutes of news coverage. So that's going to include, and it's going to be basically the time clock is going to be the first half hour and then repeated. So 6 minutes, commercial break, a few minutes for this, commercial break, a few more minutes of this, commercial break, a few more minutes of this, commercial break. You get to the bottom of the soft news of the day, and then you hit another commercial break, and then you're at the 12:30 mark, and it's the same thing again. So you have 6 minutes and then commercial breaks. And so you have a basic rundown like that. Now, not every news station follows this exactly, obviously, but this is a general format of how this kind of thing works. So I know I've got this much time to cover what I have to cover. Stuff has to get cut out, and that's just the way it is. There's no way around it, because there's only so much time in the day, and they have to have their commercials to make the money to pay the reporters and to keep the lights on. So that's a big problem with there. So the airtime right there kills it. Other thing too with newspapers, also with magazines, also with radio, also with television, is the concept of deadlines. There's only so much stuff that you're going to cover. So, and you only have so much time to get it ready. Like I know whenever I was doing, again, with newspaper, you had to send it off, then it had to get printed, and then go pick up the papers unless they're delivered, and that's a chunk of time. That's not like, like days, of course, but it's a chunk of time because it takes time to set up the print, and get it all going. And it's a really neat operation to see that kind of thing happen, but it's also time. It's a lot of time. So in the olden days, when your big newspaper outlets in big cities, they'd have a morning edition and an evening edition. And then it eventually became just dailies. You get one, and then a lot of those have disappeared, and some towns might have one a week or two a week, and that's it. So you cover a story, and you get it all ready to go, and it's too late. The newspaper deadline's passed. Or you get it just in time, and then you send it off, and then the paper comes out, and then by then a whole bunch of new developing stuff happens. Well, you're going to miss the next paper, or else it's going to be terribly late. Like, for example, this newspaper I did with this one school was once every 2 weeks. It would come out on a Monday. So if there was, like, say, something that happened that Monday, so it would drop Monday morning, and anything that happened that Monday or Tuesday would have been 2 weeks old by the time the next paper comes out. Who wants to read a news, new, the focus on the word new, newspaper with full of stories that are almost 2 weeks old? So again, it's one of those things where hitting that deadline absolutely matters. And it just might be that it's a long time till the next break. Like, for example, if you're watching your evening news, even the late night news at like 11 o'clock, it's not until the 6 a.m. news the next day. A lot of stuff can happen overnight. And if you don't get the news package sent off to the station, so you're on location reporting, you put your package together and zip it off to the station, it might be too late to get on that cycle from 11 to 11:30, and now it's no good. And maybe they could keep it until the 6 a.m., but otherwise it just might get chucked because it's too late. It's going to be old and stale by the time 6 a.m. rolls around, so we don't need this package. So again, things get cut because of just deadlines as well. So that's another thing. Now, what gets really interesting is when you start looking at the concept of what to cover, choosing what to cover. Now, this is obviously where a lot of the bias can come in. So I only have so much time. I only have so much space. What do I want to cover? So you start picking all the things that maybe sound interesting, things that would sell. And nowadays, of course, in the world of the internet and social media, it's what would get clicks. So you're choosing things that would get clicks instead of what could actually be true, genuine news. Like, this is an actual real news story. But will it get clicks? Will people stay on my station long? Will people tune in to hear the story? Maybe not. So I'm going to find this other story. The typical concept in news gathering, the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. It's the more violent, the more sensational, the more outlandish, those things get the attention. Just like another adage, Dog bites man, not a story. Man bites dog, story. Because that's odd. That's weird that a man would bite the dog. So that gets attention. So again, I'm going to choose what I'm going to cover. Now, it could also be a certain bias, like, ooh, I like this story. It's about my guy, my political side. It makes them look good. I'm going to cover this story. Or, ooh, this is damaging to the other side. I'm going to choose and run to this story. And so you see that kind of thing come into play with bias. And so it could be an overt case that way. So it could be for advertising and click and, audience retention issues. It could be that you have a certain inclination towards that story. But at the end of the day, if you only have so much space, if you only have so much time, and you want to get it in there, you're going to pick things that you think are going to be beneficial, either to your maybe political slant or to your advertising dollars to pay your bills. So you're going to, have some kind of bias that works into that. And then the reverse of that is not just what you choose to cover, but what you choose not to cover. So in other words, ooh, that makes the other side look good. I don't want to cover that story. Or, ooh, that makes my side look bad. I don't want to cover that story. These are also ways of bias that we typically see and think of when we are dealing with the idea of media bias. So we see a situation where they don't like the president, so they're going to run all the negative stories they can find, and here's a really good story that we just won't play. We won't cover that one, and you'll see that kind of a thing, quite often. So again, it's not just choosing what to cover; it's choosing what not to cover as well. So when you're looking for those stories to axe, we only have so much space. Well, axe that part, axe that story. Cut out that line, cut out that good beneficial quote or whatever, and just get rid of that one. Or that one that makes my side look bad. Cut that story and say, we just ran out of time. There's only so much space in the newspaper. What can we do? We're hamstrung by that. So you have those ways of cutting things out and claiming, of course, that you did your due diligence. Just that size of that newspaper just kept us from covering that story. What a shame. So, you see that kind of thing come into play. Now, the last part that we typically do think of is choosing not what to cover, what not to cover, but choosing how to cover. This is what we traditionally think of course, when we're thinking of media bias. So I'm going to put on my pro whatever political party hat and dive into the story, or whatever the thing happens to be. It doesn't have to be politics. It could be anything. It could be sports. And you go one way or another. And sometimes, again, we expect and want bias. Like if I'm watching the local news and we hear the sports stuff. Yeah, they're sports journalists, but I want them to like my team and be rooting for my team. If you're my hometown reporter, you should be rooting for the hometown team, by golly. But when it comes to the politics, no, you're supposed to be unbiased. It's a weird thing that we put on reporters that way, but that's just one of those things that we tend to do. So if you're looking at your political story, by golly, you better be down the middle. But if you're sports, be totally incredibly biased all you want. So, but, how to cover something becomes a major issue, because then when I walk into this story, how am I going to look at it? How am I going to frame it? How am I going to grab quotes? So you might have someone who gives an hour-long speech. Politicians give long speeches. They don't just talk in sound bites. But sound bite comes from the concept of we're going to take all of the sound of their speech. We're going to take just a bite of it out. So it's... And you can easily see how deceptive that can be. Someone says this long, really interesting narration, and they might take this. There might be this one line that sounds really damaging. We'll take that and pull it out of context. Now, if you remember from the logical fallacy podcast video we did, that's one of those things where we see that's a straw man tactic, where we take somebody out of context and amplify that. And now we're attacking that instead of attacking the whole substance of what was said. So, but that's a very common thing. We take the sound bite and we put that on, on the newscast, or make a whole article about that one sound bite and engineer it, as they say, out of whole cloth from there. But how we choose to cover something is very important. And where you get into the idea of when we start introducing image and also audio, and it's easy to manipulate and change in how that works. And we can frame an article and make it look a certain way, either good for our guy or bad for their guy, or whatever we want to do, because we can choose to do that kind of thing because, well, frankly, that's the abilities that we have. So those are some basic things I'm going to talk about when it comes to actually defining media bias. It could be just something as simple as a space issue, a time issue. Could it just be something that we're trying to draw viewers, and so we cover this story, or we want to make our guy look good or the other side look bad, and that's why we're choosing these. So you have multiple reasons, both from inclination or financial or technical, that causes bias. It's not always dirty tricks behind the scenes. I mean, it very well could be. I mean, let's not be naive about that. But there are actual technical and financial reasons why bias exists, because at the end of the day, they want paid, and they're also bound by the clock, and that's the way it has been. That's the way it always will be. So at the end of the day, yes, bias exists. We all have it. Can we eliminate it? No. Can we reduce it greatly? If we really try and if we really want to. But that's one of those things that we need to be aware of. So before we're so quick to sling mud at journalists for their bias, we have to realize there are reasons why they do it, and it's just a matter of just trying to figure out what's the reason, and then being true and fair to it. Because when it comes to bias, people understand that it exists. Most of the people would like to think it doesn't need to exist, but it does exist. And then it's a question from there for how you choose to consume it. So if you know that station is biased, if you know that reporter is biased, will you tune in? Will you continue watching? Will you click? Or will you just say, I'm not interested in that any longer? And that's the one true way to get their attention, by stop watching, stop clicking. Because if you click, if you watch, they're going to keep doing what they do. So if it's someone that you like, well, sure, you're going to keep paying attention. But if it's someone you don't like, you'll stop clicking. And that's the best way. So otherwise, I mean, that's how they pay attention. That's the ratings. The ratings drive what they do. So if you put them out of business, they kind of get the point. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.